There is a specific sound that absolute betrayal makes. It doesn't sound like a screaming match in a kitchen, and it doesn't sound like shattered porcelain. It sounds like a pneumatic lock engaging on a commercial pharmaceutical vault. At exactly 8:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, the heavy, reinforced steel door sealed shut. Inside, the temperature was already plummeting toward -50 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't a commercial meat freezer. It was a biomedical storage unit designed to preserve unstable chemical compounds. It is an environment engineered to suspend life, which makes it incredibly efficient at ending it. Through the 6-inch pane of frost-resistant observation glass, she looked at the man she had been married to for 4 years. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't have the manic, wild eyes of a cinematic villain. He looked remarkably bored. He was adjusting the lapels of his camel hair overcoat. He checked his stainless steel chronograph watch, looked back at her, and tapped his knuckles against the glass twice. A quiet, mocking farewell. Then, he turned his back and walked away down the sterile linoleum hallway. He was walking away to establish an alibi. He was walking away to let the temperature drop, to let the oxygen thin, and to eventually collect a $2 million life insurance payout on a tragic, inexplicable workplace accident. Inside the vault, the physical reality of -50 degrees began its assault. Cold at that extreme is not a temperature, it is a violent physical entity. The moisture in her eyes crystallized instantly, blurring her vision into a fractured kaleidoscope of the vault's single, clinical, blue LED temperature gauge. Every breath she drew felt like inhaling crushed glass as the sub-zero air scorched her lung tissue. But the environment was only the secondary threat. The primary threat was biological. She was an African-American woman, exactly 33 weeks pregnant with twins. The human body is a miraculous, reactive machine. The sudden, catastrophic drop in core temperature triggered an immediate, evolutionary panic response. Her body, realizing it was entering a rapid hypothermic death spiral, began to violently contract. The shock was initiating premature labor. Most people in this exact scenario would surrender to the panic. They would hammer their bleeding fists against the reinforced glass until their bones fractured. They would scream until their vocal cords tore, wasting precious oxygen, weeping as the cold slowly lulled them into a permanent, freezing sleep. That was the husband's calculation. He had banked everything on the predictable, emotional collapse of a terrified housewife. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't know who he had married. Standing in the freezing dark, clutching her swollen abdomen, she did not scream, she did not beg, she did not cry. Instead, a profound, chilling silence fell over her mind. In that sub-zero vault, the obedient, quiet, unassuming wife died. She was instantly discarded, shed like a useless second skin. In her place, a deeply buried, highly trained, psychological architecture woke up. Her breathing, previously ragged with shock, forcefully leveled out into a tactical, shallow rhythm, conserving heat, conserving oxygen. Her heart rate, which should have been spiking into a state of cardiac distress, deliberately slowed. She looked at the frost creeping up the steel walls. She felt the terrifying tightening of her first contraction, and she began to calculate. She had no coat. She had no phone. She had 2 unborn children arriving in a space completely devoid of warmth, and she had exactly 14 minutes of cognitive function left before severe hypothermia began to shut down her brain. She didn't feel fear. She felt an icy, crystalline focus. Her husband had just handed her the one thing she needed to dismantle his entire existence. Undisputed, undeniable proof. But to use it, she had to survive the impossible. She closed her eyes, embraced the brutal cold, and began the work. To the elite social circles of her husband's world, she was practically invisible. She was introduced at galas and corporate dinners as an administrative consultant, a quiet, unassuming black woman with a soft voice, immaculate posture, and a polite, deferential smile. She was the perfect accessory to a rising corporate star. To his wealthy, deeply insulated peers, she was a supporting character in his grand narrative. They looked at her and saw someone who was simply lucky to be there. That invisibility was not an accident. It was a carefully engineered camouflage. Before she met him, before the suburban house and the joint checking accounts, she did not exist on any public registry. For 7 years, she had been a deep-cover operative for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, embedded entirely within a brutal syndicate of the Russian mafia. Her actual skill set was not calendar management or data entry. Her expertise was surviving in closed, windowless rooms surrounded by men who would sever her carotid artery if her pupil dilated at the wrong question. She was a master of hyper-compartmentalization. She was trained by behavioral science units to read the microscopic twitch of a sociopath's jaw, to detect the subtle respiratory shifts that precede extreme violence, and to operate with absolute cognitive clarity under devastating physiological duress. She knew how to turn terror into actionable data. So, how does an apex predator of the intelligence community end up married to a mid-level corporate narcissist? The answer lies in the profound psychological exhaustion of the shadow life. When she finally left the undercover world, she was drowning in the adrenaline fatigue of constant survival. She craved the mundane. She wanted a life so profoundly ordinary, so painfully predictable, that it felt like an anesthetic. Her husband had offered exactly that. He was handsome, sufficiently arrogant, and entirely civilian. She mistook his shallow, self-serving vanity for harmlessness. It is a common, tragic blind spot for those who have spent their lives hunting apex monsters. They forget that mundane, everyday parasites can be just as lethal. The erosion of her boundaries did not happen overnight. Narcissistic abuse is rarely a sudden explosion. It is the slow, methodical extraction of oxygen from a room. He began with the surgical application of isolation. He weaponized classism against her, offering subtle, smiling critiques of her background, her family, and her speech, slowly alienating her from her roots. He took absolute control of their finances under the paternalistic guise of taking the burden off her shoulders. Then came the gaslighting. It was a relentless, daily rewriting of reality. He would manufacture conflicts, deny conversations that happened hours prior, and project his own volatile insecurities onto her. He was constantly testing the perimeter fences of her sanity, waiting to see if she would break. He expected her to shrink. He relied heavily on a predictable societal bias. He assumed that a quiet black woman, navigating his overwhelmingly wealthy, predominantly white corporate ecosystem, would be too intimidated, too isolated, and too desperate to maintain her newfound status to ever fight back. He believed his own superiority was an unassailable fact of the universe, but he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of her silence. When he humiliated her at dinner parties, she did not weep. She silently cataloged his behavioral baselines. When he restricted her access to the bank accounts, she did not argue. She mapped his financial vulnerabilities. He thought he was successfully breaking a fragile, dependent housewife. He did not realize that his abuse was simply triggering the dormant muscle memory of a highly trained operative. To her, the marriage had ceased to be a romantic partnership years ago. It had become an active deployment. She simply retreated back into the shadow self. She turned her domestic life into a silent, meticulously documented surveillance operation, absorbing every microaggression and every lie as empirical evidence. He looked at her calm, expressionless face and saw a woman who had surrendered. He was entirely unaware that in the wild, the most dangerous predators never make a sound before they strike. The anatomy of a narcissist's downfall always begins with a ledger. Behind the bespoke Italian suits, the country club memberships, and the meticulously curated public image, her husband was hemorrhaging money. He was a man deeply addicted to the aesthetics of wealth, but entirely devoid of the discipline required to sustain it. For 3 years, he had been quietly siphoning funds from his firm's escrow accounts, moving phantom capital through a labyrinth of shell companies to finance an elite lifestyle he could not actually afford. But the architecture of his fraud was structurally unsound. A routine federal compliance audit was scheduled for the end of the fiscal quarter. He was over-leveraged and drowning in a spectacular, silent ruin. He needed liquidity, and he needed it immediately. The exact deficit to cover his embezzlement and avoid a mandatory federal prison sentence was $2 million. In his mind, his pregnant wife was not a human being. She was not the mother of his unborn twins. She was simply an uncashed check sitting in his living room. He did not arrive at the decision to kill her with agonizing moral dread. For a true sociopath, murder is not a tragedy, it is merely a logistical pivot. But he needed an echo chamber to validate his delusion, a mirror to reflect his own manufactured superiority. Enter the mistress. She was a junior vice president at his firm, a woman sculpted from the same hollow, ambitious clay as he was. Their affair was less about passion and more about a shared, intoxicating arrogance. To them, the protagonist was a pathetic, cumbersome obstacle. The protagonist would sit quietly in the corner of their sprawling, glass-walled living room during corporate cocktail hours, sipping sparkling water, seemingly invisible. She listened as her husband and his mistress stood mere feet away, speaking to each other in low, conspiratorial tones. She watched the mistress glance at her swollen belly with unfiltered, aristocratic disgust. She heard the microscopic inflections in their dialogue, the way the mistress would say, "She really has no idea how this world works, does she?" And the way her husband would reply, "She's a temporary liability, I'm handling it." They thought they were speaking in code. They thought they were the smartest predators in the room. They had no idea they were casually debriefing a federal operative. The protagonist did not confront them. A civilian confronts, an operative collects. She began to notice the deviations in his baseline behavior. He became overly attentive, a sharp contrast to his usual dismissive cruelty. He started asking hyper-specific questions about her prenatal vitamins, her mobility, and her doctor's appointments. He was assessing the structural vulnerabilities of his target. Then came the data. Operating on encrypted channels in the dead of night, she bypassed his biometric laptop locks in under 30 seconds. She did not find love letters to the mistress. She wasn't looking for something as pedestrian as infidelity. She was looking for the math. She found the newly accelerated life insurance policy, a comprehensive, ironclad contract, specifically amended to include a double indemnity clause for accidental death on commercial property. The payout was exactly $2 million. The equation was complete. She knew the sum, she knew the motive, all that remained was the method. The day of the incident began with a masterpiece of domestic theater. He poured her decaf coffee. He placed his hand gently on her 8-month pregnant stomach, smiling warmly as he felt one of the twins kick. It was a performance of such chilling, psychopathic perfection that it would have paralyzed a normal person with cognitive dissonance. How could a man feel the life of his child beneath his palm and still calculate the exact freezing point of human blood? "I need a massive favor," he told her, his voice coated in practiced exhaustion. "There are some final incorporation papers for the new biomedical subsidiary. They need your signature as a co-director, but the documents are at the new cold storage facility across town." The courier fell through. "Could you ride out there with me tonight?" It was a clumsy, amateurish lure, but it was definitive. As they drove in the agonizing silence of his luxury sedan toward the industrial district, the protagonist ran the final risk assessment in her mind. She knew exactly what was waiting for her at the warehouse. She knew it was a lethal trap. So why did she get out of the car? Why did she walk into the cavernous, humming belly of the pharmaceutical facility? Because the burden of proof in the destruction of a powerful man is incredibly high. If she walked away, he would simply find another, less predictable way to kill her. If she went to the authorities with a printed insurance policy and a theory, he would hire a team of elite lawyers, frame her as a hysterical, paranoid, pregnant woman, and bury her in litigation until he found an opportunity to finish the job. She did not want to merely survive him. She wanted to eradicate him. To surgically and permanently dismantle a narcissist of his caliber, she needed a crime so undeniable, so physically absolute, that no amount of money or influence could spin it. She needed him to commit to the act. She needed him to close the door. As they walked down the sterile linoleum hallway toward the heavy steel vault, she felt the temperature drop. She looked at his back, watching the tension in his shoulders. She was not a victim being led to the slaughter. She was the architect, calmly guiding the subject into the center of the blast radius. He opened the heavy steel door of the vault and gestured for her to step inside to check the inventory crates. She paused on the threshold. She looked him directly in the eyes for one long, silent second. She saw the absolute void where a human soul should have been. And then, with a terrifying, cold composure of a woman who had survived monsters far worse than him, she stepped into the ice. The temperature in a biomedical vault does not simply drop, it crushes. It is a kinetic force, a heavy, invisible weight that immediately begins to shut down the biological machinery of the human body. When the first violent contraction tore through her abdomen, she did not scream. Screaming expels vital core heat and wastes precious oxygen. Instead, she initiated a psychological protocol she hadn't touched in a decade: extreme somatic triage. She detached her consciousness from the agonizing pain of her expanding pelvis and the burning sensation of frostbite blooming across her extremities. Her body became a machine, and the machine had a single absolute directive: extract the payloads, secure the assets, and breach the perimeter. She dragged herself toward the rear of the vault, her movements deliberate and painfully slow. Her eyes scanned the storage racks through the thickening fog of her own frozen breath. She located a shipment of temperature-sensitive biologics packed in military-grade thermal polyurethane and mylar lining. With numb, bleeding fingers, she shattered the protective casing, ripping the synthetic insulation from the crates. She built a crude, insulated nest on the steel floor, a microscopic pocket of heat in a landscape of absolute zero. The delivery of the twins was not a beautiful cinematic moment. It was a brutal, silent, blood-soaked extraction carried out in the dark. She bit down on the leather strap of her wristwatch to keep from shattering her own teeth as the spasms hit. When the first child arrived, a tiny, fragile boy, his skin was already mottled blue, she did not panic. She cleared his airway, wrapped him tightly in the thermal mylar, and placed him directly against her bare chest, utilizing the last of her radiating body heat. Minutes later, his sister followed. She severed the umbilical cords with the sharp, jagged edge of a broken, hard plastic casing. She was losing blood rapidly. Hypothermia was beginning to cloud her peripheral vision, painting the edges of the room in a soft, lethal gray. She had less than 4 minutes of functional consciousness remaining. Her husband had assumed the vault was an inescapable tomb. He was a civilian, entirely ignorant of federal industrial safety regulations. He didn't know that every commercial freezer is legally required to have a manual, internal override. But more importantly, he didn't know that the override on this specific model was electronically governed by the external thermostat relay. She wrapped the twins securely to her torso using strips of torn insulation. She dragged herself to the control panel beside the heavy steel door. Smashing the plastic cover of the digital gauge with her elbow, she exposed the motherboard. Her fingers, barely able to articulate, found the primary copper conduit feeding the magnetic lock. She didn't need a tool. She used the conductive metal clasp of her necklace. She jammed it across the live circuit board. A shower of blue sparks erupted, scorching her hand, followed by the heavy, mechanical thud of the multi-ton magnetic seal disengaging. She pushed the door open and stepped out of the ice. She did not go to a hospital. She did not call the police. The moment she dialed 911, she would become a victim in the public system. entirely vulnerable to her husband's wealth, his lawyers, and his narrative. Instead, she vanished. Bleeding, shivering, and carrying 2 premature infants, she bypassed the warehouse security cameras with the instinctual precision of a ghost. She reached a payphone 3 miles away and dialed a number that did not officially exist. It was an emergency extraction line, a remnant of her deep-cover days, maintained by a private network of off-the-grid medical professionals who serviced intelligence operatives. Within 20 minutes, a sterile, unmarked transport van arrived. For the next 2 months, she lived in a brilliant, terrifying silence within a secure, private medical bunker, while top-tier neonatologists stabilized her children in state-of-the-art incubators. She began the autopsy of her husband's life. Her recovery room became a war room. The walls were lined with encrypted monitors, bathing the space in a cold, digital light. Through proxy servers routed across 4 continents, she watched her husband's performance on the evening news. He played the grieving, bewildered spouse perfectly, wiping away manufactured tears as he pleaded for information about his pregnant wife's mysterious disappearance. He filed the missing persons report. He organized search parties. And then, right on schedule, he filed the paperwork to execute the $2 million life insurance policy. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully erased her. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to his empire to a phantom. With her children safe and her physical strength returning, she initiated the manufactured collapse. It was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing, algorithmic strangulation. She began with his offshore liquidity. Utilizing biometrics and passwords she had quietly harvested over 4 years of marriage, she bypassed the firewalls of his Cayman Island accounts. She did not steal the money. She simply evaporated it, dispersing the funds into thousands of untraceable shell corporations disguised as bad investments. When he checked his balance to pay his most urgent creditors, he found zeros. Panic began to set in, but she was just getting started. Next, she triggered the margin calls. She manipulated his domestic portfolios, creating the illusion of massive, catastrophic losses. His brokers, terrified by the sudden drop in his perceived net worth, began demanding immediate capital to cover his leveraged positions. Capital he no longer had. He was bleeding out financially, and he couldn't figure out where the wound was. Then came the psychological torture. She needed him desperate. She needed him to feel the walls closing in, to force him to rely entirely on the impending $2 million insurance payout as his sole salvation. Through an anonymous, encrypted data dump, she routed the meticulous evidence of his corporate embezzlement to the compliance officers within his own firm and simultaneously to the Securities and Exchange Commission. She framed the data perfectly, making it look like a leak from his trusted mistress. Sitting in the glow of her monitors, she watched his digital life implode. She monitored his frantic emails, his encrypted text messages to his mistress that spiraled from arrogant coordination into vicious, paranoid accusations. He believed his mistress had betrayed him. His firm suspended him pending a federal investigation. His creditors began circling his assets like vultures. Everything he had built, his entire identity, was being systematically dismantled by an invisible hand. He was suffocating under the weight of his own collapsing reality, constantly refreshing his bank portal, waiting for the insurance money that would save him from federal prison. What he didn't know was that she had already contacted the insurance conglomerate's fraud division using a burner identity, citing severe legal irregularities in the claim. The payout was frozen indefinitely in administrative purgatory. She had built an inescapable, airtight labyrinth of ruin. She had stripped away his money, his reputation, and his allies. She had reduced a narcissistic predator to a desperate, paranoid animal pacing in a cage of his own making. The autopsy was complete. The trap was set. It was time to show him who had built it. 6 months is precisely how long it takes for a narcissist to convince himself that he has gotten away with murder. It is the gestation period of absolute hubris. By December, the narrative of his tragedy had been perfectly polished. He had played the role of the devastated, grieving widower to such perfection that his elite social circle had not only forgiven his previous financial erraticism but had rallied behind him. To celebrate his resilience and the launch of his newly restructured firm, he hosted a black-tie gala at a private, glass-walled club overlooking the city skyline. 50 of the city's most influential figures stood in the room, sipping vintage champagne, bathed in the warm golden light of crystal chandeliers. His mistress, now publicly elevated to the role of his supportive partner, stood by his side wearing a gown paid for by the illusion of his wealth. He was standing at the podium, adjusting the microphone, smiling with the effortless charm of a man who believes he has conquered the universe. He had checked his offshore portal that morning and seen a pending wire transfer for exactly $2 million from the life insurance conglomerate. He thought his nightmare was over. He thought the phantom bleeding of his accounts was just a glitch, a string of bad luck that the payout would finally erase. He raised his glass to toast to new beginnings. He never got to take the sip. The heavy, mahogany double doors of the ballroom did not simply open. They were pushed wide by the undeniable, physical weight of consequence. The low murmur of the string quartet faltered and died. The clinking of crystal stopped. 50 heads turned toward the entrance. She did not walk in looking like a victim. She did not look like the quiet, mousy administrative consultant they had all patronized for 4 years. She stepped through the doors wearing a perfectly tailored, jet black suit. Her posture was flawless, radiating a terrifying, gravitational authority. Flanking her were 4 men in tactical windbreakers bearing the insignias of federal regulatory and investigative agencies, alongside a private security detail that moved with the silent, lethal precision of military contractors. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls behind her, the guests could see the sleek, armored silhouette of a custom Rolls-Royce Phantom idling at the curb. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the suffocating vacuum of a reality completely fracturing. She walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. The elite guests, suddenly realizing they were standing in the blast radius of something catastrophic, instinctively parted to make way for her. The mistress took one look at the federal agents, dropped her champagne flute, and backed away, her face draining of all color. But the protagonist did not look at the mistress. She did not look at the guests. She kept her eyes locked entirely on the man at the podium. As she approached, she watched the biological collapse of his ego. A sociopath can lie to a jury, but they cannot lie to their own nervous system. The smug, aristocratic smile melted off his face. His hands began to tremble so violently that the microphone stand rattled. His brain was desperately trying to process the impossible geometry of a ghost walking toward him. She reached the podium. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply reached out, took the microphone from his paralyzed grip, and turned to the crowd. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was smooth, analytical, and impossibly cold. It echoed through the massive room like a judge reading a terminal sentence. "My husband has always been a man who appreciates a meticulous presentation. He invited you all here tonight to celebrate the survival of his empire. But I am afraid there has been a slight miscalculation in the accounting." She pulled a small encrypted drive from her pocket and handed it to one of the federal agents, who immediately plugged it into the venue's audiovisual system. The massive digital screens behind the podium, which had been glowing with his new corporate logo, suddenly flashed black. When they illuminated again, they were not showing corporate branding. They were projecting highly classified, itemized banking ledgers. "For the past 3 years," she continued, her voice perfectly level, "my husband has embezzled exactly $4.2 million from his clients' escrow accounts to fund a lifestyle he could not afford. The documents you are looking at trace every phantom wire transfer, every offshore shell company, and every forged signature. Copies of these files have already been authenticated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, whose representatives are currently sealing the doors of this room. A wave of panicked murmurs ripped through the crowd as the city's elite realized they were drinking champagne at a crime scene. But she wasn't finished. Financial ruin, however, is merely a symptom, she said, turning her head slightly to look directly at him. The disease is how he intended to cover the deficit. The screens behind her shifted again. This time, it wasn't spreadsheets. It was the internal security logs of the biomedical warehouse. It was the digital footprint of the vault's thermostat being overridden. It was the signed accelerated life insurance policy with the $2 million double indemnity clause highlighted in stark yellow. 6 months ago, he locked me inside a commercial pharmaceutical vault at -50 degrees. I was 33 weeks pregnant. He walked away, expecting the hypothermia to trigger a fatal cardiac event, so he could collect the insurance payout to avoid federal prison. She paused. The silence in the ballroom was so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The husband was gasping, his chest heaving as if he were the one suffocating in the ice. He looked around wildly, but his peers, his investors, his social lifelines, they were all physically stepping away from him, staring at him with undisguised horror. "He thought I was a civilian," she stated quietly, the truth finally stepping out of the shadow. "He did not know that before I married him, I spent 7 years as a deep-cover operative for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He thought he was trapping a housewife. He did not realize he was simply handing a federal agent the unassailable proof of his own premeditated attempted murder." The husband's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from collapsing to the floor. "The money," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy whisper. "The wire transfer. It cleared this morning. I saw it." For the first time all evening, the protagonist smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant expression of absolute victory. "The $2 million did clear," she whispered, leaning in so only he and the front row could hear the final nail being hammered into the coffin. "But it didn't clear into your account. The portal you logged into this morning was a mirrored honeypot I built 3 weeks ago. The actual funds were seized at 8 a.m. by the Department of Justice under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are nothing." She took one step back, yielding the space. "Oh, and one last thing," she added casually, her voice softening just a fraction, twisting the blade one final time. "The twins are beautiful. They have my eyes. You will never, ever see them." She gave a brief nod to the tactical team. 2 federal agents stepped forward, grabbing the husband by his bespoke lapels. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the ballroom, sounding exactly like a pneumatic lock engaging on a vault door. She stood perfectly still, watching as he was dragged away in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress, weeping and entirely broken. The execution was complete. The architecture of his lies had collapsed, and she was the only one left standing in the ruins. There is a specific kind of death that happens to a narcissist when you permanently remove their audience. It is not physical, but it is absolute. When the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary closed behind him, he did not find a stage. He found concrete, fluorescent lighting, and total, deafening irrelevance. The mistress he had paraded like a trophy took a federal immunity deal before his limousine was even impounded. The corporate peers who had drank his champagne scrubbed his name from their directories within 24 hours. His assets were liquidated, his legacy evaporated, and his reality was reduced to an 8x10 cell. For a man who built his entire existence on the perception of his own superiority, being forgotten is a punishment far worse than being hated. He is no longer a corporate titan or a mastermind. He is just a number in a beige uniform, screaming his innocence into a void that simply does not care. 3,000 miles away, in a room flooded with warm, golden afternoon sunlight, the cold is finally gone. She sits in a rocking chair, watching her twins sleep in their cribs. They are healthy, vibrant, and entirely untouched by the frost of the world they were born into. She does not look over her shoulder anymore. She does not analyze the micro-expressions of the people around her for hidden threats. She has retired the operative, and she has permanently buried the obedient, terrified wife. What remains is an integrated, whole human being. She has reclaimed not just her financial independence, but the true wealth of an unburdened mind. Her victory was not merely in the act of revenge. Revenge is reactionary. It is driven by anger and chaos. What she executed was a reclamation. She dismantled his life so she could finally begin her own, securing a perimeter of absolute peace around her children. Society has a fundamental misunderstanding of karmic justice. We romanticize it as a mystical, unseen hand that reaches down from the heavens to strike the wicked. We wait for the universe to magically balance the scales. But karma is not magic. It is simply the architecture of truth. It is the mathematical, inevitable consequence of reality asserting itself over a lie. A life built on deception, manipulation, and the subjugation of others is structurally unsound. It requires constant, exhausting maintenance. The narcissist must spin an endless web of illusions just to keep the roof from caving in. Karmic justice is not a lightning strike, it is gravity. It is the moment the foundation simply can no longer bear the weight of the fraud. She did not destroy him. She merely stopped holding up the walls of his delusion and let the physics of his own arrogance crush him. If there is a lesson to be extracted from the ice, it is a profound truth about the nature of strength. True power never needs to shout. It does not need to posture, to humiliate, or to demand an audience. True power is perfectly comfortable in the dark. It observes, it calculates, and it endures. The most dangerous thing a predator can do is mistake a survivor's silence for surrender. They look at the quiet and think they have won. They never realize that the silence is not a white flag. It is the sound of the trap setting